Welcome to Field Notes for Pastors, a conversational podcast for pastors and others in ministry as we explore our soul-deep work in the fields of the Lord. Whether you're in a ministry season of fullness or famine, we want to explore themes around Paul's words in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 6. I planted the seed, Apollos watered it, but God has been making it grow. In today's episode, I'm so thankful to welcome Vince Bacote as we explore the topic of the pastor as theologian in the philosophical context of our time. Dr. Vincent Bacote is a professor of theology and the director of the Center for Applied Christian Ethics at Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois. He is the author of Reckoning with Race and Performing the Good News in Search of a Better Evangelical Theology, came out in 2020. The Political Disciple, A Theology of Public Life, released in 2015, and has contributed to many other volumes, magazines, and journals. Most recently, Vince co-created and narrated Black and Evangelical, a feature-length documentary that profiles the history, struggles, and contributions of African-American evangelicals. He is a member of the Evangelical Theological Society and the Society of Christian Ethics. He resides in the Chicago area with his family, and I am particularly glad to have Vince with us today because he has sharpened my own theological thinking. He's been a meaningful conversation partner around the multi-ethnic vision of the gospel, and he's someone I consider a friend. So welcome to the podcast, Vince.
Hey, it's great to be a part of this.
Thank you so much for doing this with me. I'm just wondering if you can give everybody who's listening just a little background on what you're up to now, and perhaps also just a little bit of background in ministry as relates to our conversation.
Sure. So what I'm doing now is the last 2 weeks of class. I can't believe it, honestly. So whenever people are hearing this, it's 2 weeks. It's December 1st, and I don't know how we got here, but we did. It's been a blur of a semester, a great semester, but a blur of a semester. And the biggest thing I'm trying to do, in addition to promoting the documentary, is finish a long overdue eschatology and ethics book, which I think you and I have discussed.
We have discussed this.
I'm not going to ask how many times. I'm like, yeah, so I think this summer is going to be it. Well, my aspiration is to finish it this month, which right now means, as we're speaking, that there's about 20,000 words I want to write this month. I think I could do it. So hopefully by the time people are hearing that, this Baker Academic has the book. That's the biggest thing. And in terms of my background, so I wanted to be a veterinarian when I was growing up. And I wanted to be many things, actually. You know, a rock and roll star, a professional tennis player, but also loved animals. 8th grade, decided I wanted to be a veterinarian. The other things were kind of fantastical things. My undergrad degree is in biology. Did not go to veterinary school. Wound up going to seminary instead to Trinity Divinity School, which will now soon be the Divinity School of Trinity Western University in Canada. That's another podcast, obviously, to talk about that. But while at TEDS, because I went there planning to be a pastor, I discovered I was one of them. That's probably the best way to put it. Now, discovering I was one of them, that all happened in a not so smooth process, in the sense that when I thought about, with the help of others, pursuing a PhD rather than going the route of being a full-time pastor, I did have a kind of vocational crisis, because I was wondering if people were going to be disappointed, because all these people I told them I was going to seminary, to go into pastoral ministry. Am I going to be, are people going to be like, I'm so disappointed, or I thought you were going to do this? And instead, there was waves of affirmation by how much sense it made that I was going to be a professor. And so I'm a person, the way I would describe it is, I've come to describe it as, I'm essentially a theologian and ethicist, in the sense that, to me, what we believe matters, how we live out what we believe matters. So a living faith oriented towards not just our internal lives, but how it affects all of life. So that's the public engagement piece of it. And I think a lot of my conversations have been around trying to make the case for the being public, right? Some people write about, they're describing how the public, or describing political liberalism, or describing politics in the Bible, etc. It's not that I don't talk about those things, but for me, the big thing has been our fundamental orientation theologically towards the public, and how what we believe is doing that, orienting us to the public. I think that's been a big part of what I've done. And then that's been connected to obviously things like race, talking about evangelicalism, talking about politics, talking about faith and work, talking about, culture, movies, all that kind of stuff. And so that's kind of been sort of my thing, right? And so belief matters. So yes, doctrine, belief matters, but belief not as an abstraction, but as something that walks around. So ethics is inescapably tied to that for me. So that's kind of my thing. That's kind of, and so command central, I like to say, is being a professor. Out of that, speaking, teaching, writing, trying to do some coaching, consulting, all around, all those types of things. So that's sort of the Bacotean thing.
That's it. Yeah. And I think our first point of connection really probably came when I was wrestling through aspects of what we call political theology and how does the church engage with the public sphere, in your book, The Political Disciple. But one of the things I've appreciated so much about you is that you bring your theology in service of the church. And I think some of that could be in the mindset of thinking when you went to divinity school that you were going to be a pastor. So you do have that heart for the church in what you're doing, not just you are a well renowned, in a sense, academic theologian, but you also bring that in service of the church. And so that kind of leads into one of the questions I want to kind of start as a fundamental for our conversation today. Is it's a basic, it may be something we would skip over, but why do you think that theology is important for pastors and those in ministry? Again, this may just taken for granted, but I don't want to take it for granted. Why do you think theology is important for pastors and those in ministry as we enter into this discussion?
I wish I could take it for granted, is what I would like to say. But
exactly
what I've learned is that, unfortunately, words like theology and doctrine, if you think about theology being the doing of theology, right, and doctrine being the result of what we've done, in other words, the statements we're making, it always needs a public relations program, because sometimes there's a bad discourse, or somebody was in a church where people got in fights about certain particulars, and people include me out of that. And some people, because of how people have been caught up in the weeds of theology, they might think when they go in terms of ministry, I'm not one of those theologian guys who's always talking about all these details. I remember once Christianity Today talked about these different models of being pastors, and one of them was like the theologian kind of pastor, and another one was like a visionary leader, one's like an evangelist, etc. Certain people's gifts will inform, if you will, the flavor, the characteristics of their ministry. But the fact of the matter is that everyone is inescapably theological. Reason number one is because the root word of theology is God. If you're in ministry, you want people to have some kind of encounter with God. You want them to know God. You want them to be informed about God. You want them to live their lives with God in some way. And so even if you're not using any particular technical language around theology, what people are doing is still something that is theological, because you are talking about God things.
Right.
So God, Jesus, church, mission, all those things. Big picture, it's about God made this world. God has revealed himself to this world. He wants people to be related to him. He wants them to live their lives with and for him in the world. And all the different things connected to that are theological matters. And so that's why theology is inescapable and important. I think sometimes if people hear theology, they're thinking something more formal, or they're thinking something very academic and particular. In fact, personal story, it's a lot like a lot of my spiritual growth in college came through the church group, the Navigators. I'm very thankful for that. I remember going to a Navigator summer training program, now to date myself, in the summer of 1985.
Ooh.
And Yes, that's right. Back then, and I remember talking to the person who was running the program before going, and I said, "What are we going to do over there?" And I loved doing our Bible study stuff. So I thought, "Hey, more Bible study." And he goes, "Well, we're going to cover some basic Christian doctrine." Now, this is dial-up phones. Okay, we don't have Google Meet and Zoom and all these things, so I can't see him and he can't see me. But if he had seen me, he would have noticed a change in my facial expression. My nonverbals would have betrayed the fact that all of a sudden I was concerned. Doctrine. Oh man, it's going to be boring. It's going to be abstract. And then I discovered, and maybe this was one of the keys of me becoming what I am, but I discovered that it was just basically looking at the Bible, but trying to talk in a kind of summary fashion about different big pieces of the Christian faith. Right? So what do we mean when we talk about salvation or dimensions of salvation? How are we talking about all that kind of stuff? Justification, sanctification, substitutionary atonement, all that type of stuff. And so I thought it was great. Right. And so it was not what I thought it was. And so to me, I think a lot of times the question is, what are people thinking that it is? Right. Because really theology is not the enemy of the church. There might be ways of doing theology that people think are enemies of the church. But if you're in the game of pastoral life, you're in the game of theology. It's inescapable.
Yeah, it's just part of what we're doing as pastors or those in ministry. And I think when I'm hearing you, I love hearing that little seed of maybe your calling that was just sort of nurtured through that summer training program with navigators and how God was doing things along your journey. Now, I know some pastors in my circles of friends who think that pastors or those leading ministries are not rigorous enough theological thinkers. And then I have some others who I think might say that many theologically minded pastors are out of touch with the real issues people in their pews or their ministries are dealing with. What would you say to that kind of apparent dilemma? Like, okay, some people are just too rigorous theologians, but they're disconnected, and others who maybe just say, hey, we need to get deeper into the theology.
Sure. Well, I think one of the things is to understand that the big thing we're talking about is people having a life with God. And so how do you want that to be happening? How are you forming people? How are you hoping that they are going to not just know God, but live like somebody who knows God? In other words, there are these truths, but these truths are not just things that people say, they're things that people perform. And if that's what people are doing, then given whatever the tendencies are, some people might think, hey, I don't want to get too deep into the weeds of all this. I really care about what we're doing. Great. Think about it in terms of what's the basis of what you're doing. Why are you doing this? What are you hoping for with the people? What do you want? If you want them to know God, how are you thinking about them knowing God? Because you don't want them to just be people that are doing certain things, or in your ministry, you don't want to be just thinking about being very skillful about accomplishing certain tasks, as if the tasks are somehow detached from having attention to specifics about the faith. I mean, again, some people, if you've been burned by people being too particular, then you might say, I don't want to get too deep in all that, 'cause I don't want to be divisive. I want people to know God, etc. Well, then focus on the knowing God, because you'll have to do that. You've got to be thinking about what God's revealed about himself in the Bible, and how are we helping people to know what that is. And however you're doing that, you're not just quote unquote talking about what's in the text. You're talking about how am I making sense of that, and you're doing something theological. On the flip side, I think people that care a lot about the importance of confession, to me, the important thing is, how are you thinking about the way that what we believe is showing up in people's lives?
Yeah.
And how are you thinking about the way that that is showing up in the specific situations of people's lives? And of course, there's all kinds of things that people are going through. I keep discovering all these different ways. As a pastor, obviously, you know this. I mean, there's so many different things that people are going through, so many dilemmas that people have. And here's the thing, by the way, a lot of those dilemmas have nothing to do with like just the things that we talk about with all the polarization in society right now. There's just all these life things that if you say that God is good, that God cares, if you say that God is with us, they're thinking, would you like to tell me how that works out with all this stuff? That's the opportunity, I think, to say, all right, how's this not just what we say? And also, arguably, how's it what we say without saying that because I get my doctrine right, does that mean that it just everything else just kind of takes care of itself?
Right.
I mean, I wish that it did.
Exactly.
Because if it did, nobody would think, for example, that the word evangelical means something besides good news. And unfortunately, at least as of the day that we're recording this podcast, there's a public relations problem for the word evangelical. Good news is not the first thing a lot of people are thinking.
No, it becomes skewed. And I mean, I want to come back to that discussion just a little bit in relation to our current setting. But I think I love how you're bringing in the words formation. What do people think? Man, while you're talking, I can't help but think of that old statement. It's kind of overused maybe a while back, but Tozer's knowledge of the holy, what comes into your mind when you think about God is the most important thing about you, in the sense of also how that lives out. And I think there's a group of pastors I know who might become more pragmatists. Hey, we're just going to get people to serve in our church. We're going to get people in a small group. And then others I know who maybe, but we got to get the doctrine in there. And I think those things have to come together. I think of the old kind of the phrase, the lived theology, right? How do we bring these things together? And they don't need to be at odds with each other. They should actually come together in people's lives, right down into the ordinary things like, how do I deal with my finances, or I'm struggling in this relationship? It is a theological issue at its root. It's not just a pragmatic issue.
I sometimes like to say, if you ask people about Jesus, it's interesting that Jesus asks people both, who do you say I am? So it's information about who he is, but he also says, follow me. There's not a competition in terms of Jesus with who do you say I am and the invitation to follow me. He wants both.
Yes.
It's not that one matters more than the other. Yes, we all have our gifts, talents, abilities, and tendencies, but we have to be thinking about confessing our faith, but also performing it.
I want to pick that up just a little bit around the topic of our current context to society, what's going on in the world. And I think one of the things that pastors have to be is obviously good theologians, and we talk about confession or basics of theology and bringing that into our ministry, but also being able to understand sort of the theology. We may not use that language, the philosophical frameworks of our context around us. How do you think that the pastor, the ministry leader, can engage with understanding that dominant or the range of philosophical views? Is this an essential for those in ministry? How do we understand the theology that shapes our culture, our current context? How do we engage with that?
I think at the very least, we have to be attentive to what are the big stories that people are telling.
Okay.
And here's the thing. The point is that if we're talking about like what sort of the reigning philosophies are, the big stories are telling you what those reigning philosophies are. You got to be talking about Kant or Hegel or, Hume or somebody. And, it's really more, how are people making sense of the world, and what's determining how people are deciding what's most important. How are they deciding who they're going to trust, how they're deciding what life is all about.
Mm-hmm.
And there are lots of, I could say, carnival barkers, if you will, who are, maybe I'm dating myself with that, but what's a carnival barker? Someone who's calling out to the people, hey, I've got something for you.
Yeah.
And of course, usually though, a carnival barker, it's to their advantage, not to yours.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the good thing about social media is we have mass communication. The bad thing about social media is we have mass communication because everybody has a megaphone. And so
Yep.
a lot of people are happy to share their ideas, whether they're half baked, not baked at all, or fully baked, if you will. And in the avalanche of communication, it can be very hard for people to discern. And so I think it's important for pastors to have a sense, hey, what are people around me
Mm-hmm.
hearing? One of the things I think is important is how are people deciding just what's most important?
Mm-hmm.
And I would say in the current moment, if people are operating out of fear, because there's a lot of fear in our context now,
Mm-hmm.
and that fear is driving ways that people are responding to other people. And it's also, I think, driving the way that they have an anxiety about whatever's going on in the world in their lives. Okay, well, what is the basis of your fear?
Mm-hmm.
In other words, what big stories are the ones that you're thinking, if A, then we're in the apocalypse. If B,
Mm-hmm.
then maybe we'll get out of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So what is framing all of that? Because it's how people are making sense of the world.
Yeah. And I think like one or two follow-up questions for me. One avenue would be, hey, Vince, tell us what you think are those main stories operating in our world today. And I think another one that's really important for pastors when you're talking about attentiveness is how do we even identify what those stories are that people are living by? Do you have any guidance on either side of that?
Sure. For the last one, I'll start by, I think, introducing people to the idea of something called control beliefs are important. And they don't have to call it control beliefs. It's just really whatever else is really functioning as the primary convictions that people have.
Mm-hmm.
I would like to believe that the simple formula for Christian ethics is, okay, here's what we believe. And now let's discern how that is a lens on the world, and then how with that lens in the world, it gives us a perception that gives us an orientation for going about our lives. The problem is that people also have other loyalties and commitments and beliefs, and those things also function as sometimes competing authorities.
Mm-hmm.
And if we're not asking what those competing authorities are, then they kind of have free reign to do what they want. And we might think that we're only doing things out of saying that I'm just doing it out of love for Jesus. Like, well, actually, you might be doing it out of love for your family, or love for your part of the country, or love for, a particular cultural reality, or love for something political, etc.
Mm-hmm.
And those other things, if they are not checked, how do you know that what you are saying about your faith and how you want your faith to matter in the moment?
Mm-hmm.
How do you know that actually what you're saying is, how can my faith be baptizing these other ideas?
Mm-hmm.
And so what are some of the dominant ideas? I think a subterranean idea is, in other words, a basic assumption is that in spite of whatever people are saying about the challenges economically, like with buying a home, all those types of things, that a subterranean belief that's almost hardwired in the United States is, if I'm a citizen of the United States, I'm in a place that gives me the opportunity as an individual to have the life that I want.
Mm-hmm.
And the point being that this is the promise of this country where we talk about rights, and where at least post-World War II, we talk about an American dream, where there are enough stories narrated to us about people having a certain kind of life. as evidenced by at least, there's this language called the curated self, the self that people choose to present, that was curated and presented to us as look at the good life that I have.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, look at my house. Look at my car. Look at the products that I buy. Look at how cute my kids are. Look at how, look at my nice neighborhood. And even if there's a narratives of struggle, the narratives of struggle are still, but we're making it because we can make it here. And so I think that is a huge, deep-seated belief. And I think it's also a deep-seated belief that's part of the reason for the polarization, in the sense that when people see that is threatened, okay, who is threatening that? Is it the left? Is it the right? Who are they? And when there's fear around that, right, and fear around something that is really, really your right. I mean, to my rights language, it's something that is due to me. This is due to me to have that kind of life. And they are getting in the way of me having it. And so then the criticisms of the country are because the country's not delivering on what's my right. You promised me that I'm supposed to have a certain kind of life. So I think that's a big one. I think there's certainly, in spite of critiques of it, we are in a world where there is still this way of becoming a somebody that we create. And interestingly, I think that there are even ways that people can, in their response, they might be responding to it. But I think about some of the people who are, trends about, hey, we want to be a certain kind of Christian family with X number of kids, etc. I want to think, okay, first of all, where do you get that idea from? And do you really think that idea, by the way, if you're a Christian, that that's what people were doing in the first century, in the Roman Empire, in really another world, very different from the world that we're living in? Because there's all these kinds of things that we assume.
Yeah.
And I'm using that as one example, but I think there are ways people, even in their response to bad versions of people determining who they are and what their life should be, that sometimes the response to that still winds up being a kind of version of something presented to you. Okay, here's what your life is supposed to be like. When it's like, okay, you mean our life in a post-Enlightenment modern world that most people have never lived in. There's all these things that we can assume. And my point is that there's a lot of things that are assumed about being people in this world of conveniences, this consumerism, and here's the thing, and lots of positives that makes people's lives much easier,
right,
than people's lives have been for most of history. That there's things that create all that we can just take for granted, but that this is just the way it's supposed to be.
Yeah, sort of these ideas that like the things behind the things, the assumptions that are unnamed that contribute to this sort of view of what the good life is, and then you talk about these controlling beliefs, and I think sometimes it's hard to even identify those because they may not be named, but like you said, subterranean underneath this idea of what the good life is in our time, in our day, and kind of assuming that that's what all humanity has viewed the good life as, but there are very specific things, I think, in cultures and eras and times. And this kind of ability to present a certain kind of life, and also this desire for, especially in the North American vision, the ability to have control and access to the life that I want. It's very unique to our time.
It is.
So when you think about pastors or ministry leaders trying to get at those things and understand it, how would you encourage pastors and those in ministry to continue a meaningful yet fruitful life that is theologically informed and aware, whether it's kind of in the theology of the church out of the great tradition, developing their minds, developing their connections there, or being aware of the world around and the philosophical currents? Are there things or specific people you think, hey, everybody should be reading this person, or everybody should be doing this kind of thing as pastors or ministry leaders?
I think the first thing I like to encourage people to do is, how well do you know whatever tradition you're a part of?
Okay. Yeah.
Because, I mean, do you actually know this tradition? Some people, they do know their tradition really well. But also, in knowing your tradition, do you know your tradition in terms of how it's, if there are things that are fault lines, why are those the fault lines? I've started telling students that when they're thinking about going to seminary, that they need to recognize that wherever they're going, they're stepping into pre-existing conversations. And that there are things that are going on there where people will tell you that this is important, this is the fault line, or be wary of this. And then you go somewhere else, and that's not what people are telling you different things.
Yeah, right.
And so I think, why do people have the fault lines that they do? How did that happen? When did that become the fault line? Because a lot of times and a lot of times that may be about a belief, that may be about practices. And the point isn't, once you know what that is, then that's a reason to dismiss it, or et cetera. It's like, no, it's just knowing why some things are magnified in your context that are not magnified elsewhere.
Yeah, know the story of your tradition,
Exactly.
know it well,
I think,
be able to
that's
understand
really
it.
Yeah. And also, I would encourage people to find ways to learn about where you are. You know, what's it like in this place? If you're in Southern California, for example, one of the things I've learned, not that I've been there tons of times, a friend of mine who's a pastor there talks about that they're always saying goodbye to people. Because a lot of times people come there for, the industry or something else, and they're there for a while and then they move on. Now, obviously, there are people who've been there, that live their entire lives there, but there's also a lot of people that come and go. That's very different than a place where, well, here's an example. Last couple weeks ago, I was in Boston, and somebody who did not grow up in Boston, but has been living there over 20 years now, he's in Boston. He said, Boston is a city of invitation, is what I've learned. What I've learned about the Northeast, so people tell me, is that being from there is really important.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's very different than being in LA. Okay.
Yeah.
So, and my point is that, okay, well, why is that so important? And why is this a city of invitation? And so, and if you're doing ministry is going to be very different in those situations. I mean, how do you cultivate community in those two different places? They're not, they're very different, right?
Yeah.
And so, I think just that attention to what's happening in the context, so, what's kind of perennial, what's changing is really important.
Yeah, I love that too. Just being a learner of your specific context, really, just paying attention. Here I am in Milwaukee. Milwaukee's different than LA or Boston.
Yeah.
Each place. And then cities different from rural areas. I was talking to a pastor just this last week who's more in a rural area, and he was saying how slow paced and slow to change his context is. And I was like, okay, that's a little different than where I am, but still Milwaukee compared to LA would be very slow. In that pace. Yeah.
And it, depending on the size of a person's church, obviously, this is hard, is maybe easier or harder to do. But what kinds of conversations are you able to have with people at your church about how they're perceiving things and making sense of things and concerned about things? And by the way, again, not necessarily just around hot button issues,
right?
But around other stuff. Because again, I think that's more, a window into how people are making sense of things. Yes, what people are thinking about politics, or what they're thinking about certain, whether about sexuality or race. Those things are important, but what else besides those things is going on? A lot.
A lot.
And how are people thinking about those things?
There's somebody I know who is, as a pastor, really views that one of the key roles of ministry is to cultivate conversation amongst your congregation, to get people talking about things.
Yes.
And he sort of says that if in this time and such polarization, if the church can't be a place where we can talk about different views of things, like where else could you do that? We should be the place where we can come together around
Yeah.
the cross of Christ and hear each other and
Yeah.
hear each other with love and be able to engage with that. And whether it's like a hot button issue or just a topic that's pressing to someone because of their life situation, being able to engage with that. I love that idea of just creating conversations.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that'd be
Yeah.
important. The tricky thing for me about like, is there a book I recommend? Is that because my mind works like a synthesizing machine, and I'm always like observing stuff. It's hard for me to talk about like one particular thing, aside from
Sure.
your book, of course.
Oh, thank you so
because
much.
because your book. But it's true. It's true. As I've told you, and you know, the gardening metaphor is so important because, and you did not ask me to say this, thinking about, before and after generationally, thinking about seasons, thinking about the planting of seeds, thinking about, how much, do we see the fruit of the planting seeds? What's going to happen? What do we get to see? What do we not get to see? And even if we think about, if you're in a place where people are, it's very transitional, what seeds are you planting that somebody, it's going with that person? You may not know for years or ever what that person did. It's interesting when I might occasionally hear from a student, now that I'm, my 26th year here at Wheaton, and I had no idea. Or somebody will tell me, oh yeah, someone will come to me and say, oh, hey, I know these people that went to Wheaton and they mentioned you and they were talking about how helpful you were. And I was like, oh, thanks. Because you just don't know.
You don't know. Yeah. What's going to come back around.
Yeah. And so I think your book's really, really helpful for us thinking about that. And again, also thinking about seasons being really important, because that just gives us perspective about what we're going through personally, but also what goes on in the life of a church. The idealist that I am, I would love, and I've realized that this is having a realized eschatological vision of church.
Yes.
I was like, hey, can we just have like everything just be humming at like the perfect RPMs all the time? And we're just doing the thing. And it's really quite nice. Even with whatever's going on with the rhythms of life, but it's all just good all the time. And that's wanting what happens when Jesus comes back. When the way that we experience life is that seasons change and things are good, things are challenging, things are fast, things are slow. That's the reality.
Yeah. Yeah. There's fluctuation in our existence, in our life, in our world. And I think the seasons remind us of that, thinking about the seasons. We're recording this after we both experienced a tremendous snowfall. So we feel the seasons as a very much a reality. And I think, sometimes when we think about that too, I mean, the church in North America, all the statistics are saying things like, oh, the church is in decline. It's true in the main line. It's actually true kind of across the board now. Pew Research Center is saying these kind of things. And I do think the view that brings hope actually is part of what you just mentioned, that eschatological vision, which is part of your area of focus. And I guess I didn't ask you to think about this ahead of time, but as we think about the church in decline in North America, or at least that's sort of the word that's out there, how would you see a theologically rich eschatological vision of the church helping us navigate a time of decline? Where does that speak into it? How does that theology shape our way of viewing as pastors or disciples in this moment?
I think a couple of things. One is, eschatology tells us, one, God wins in the end, as people will be with him. So we have to keep that in mind, no matter what else is being reported. So we have to be thinking about what is reported is telling us about what you might be looking at in the moment, or might be looking at some trend line. But even as people look at those trend lines, it didn't dawn on me until maybe something that Ryan Burge or somebody wrote recently. when people were talking about the nuns, how much were people mainly thinking about evangelicals when they thought that, because of the way it was being reported? And really, most of the nuns, while certainly some evangelicals, it's like, it was a lot of mainline people. But nobody was really talking about it that way. It was getting stated in a way that suggested that the problem was really people that were kind of going off the reservation and arguably because it's coinciding with people sort of announcing that they're going off the reservation in evangelical spaces. But there's all kinds of people that identify as Christians and for differing motivations. And eschatology, I think, honestly helps us to have a realistic vision about the fact that, well, it's surprising and unsurprising in certain ways. So surprising in this sense that surprising that there might be people that surprise, they're actually God's people for whatever reason. They are living like they are off the reservation, but they never left the reservation. They're like, I always talk about, like, if you think about a ranch that's like has miles and acres of property where you can't even see the big house from the gate. You got to drive in like 15 minutes before you see the big house. There are people who are, like football fields away from the gate and can't see the big house, but they don't see the gate either. And they're kind of living on the reservation in this place that may seem like kind of like their own little domain, but they never left the reservation. And then there are other people that might be showing up in the big house, but they never actually really belonged to the reservation. They were always visitors in the first place. Their presence doesn't tell us necessarily. It's like you don't know sometimes who the sheep and the goats are. But Scripture teaches us that, so we shouldn't be surprised about that. And the point is that when with all the conversation about how much religiosity there is in the United States, there's one thing is, okay, yes, whatever it is, we're still way more religious than most parts of the world, certainly more than Europe, but not even close to being what Europe is. And so how are people thinking about decline? It doesn't mean, and all of a sudden the United States became like Europe. That's not what's happening. So there's that piece. The other piece, though, is also that the United States is not the center of salvation history. And so it's easy to think when you're a big superpower and you've had all these things happen and you've produced all these ministries, et cetera, that this is what it's always been about. It's like the Bible's not even talking about this particular part of the globe, except being where the nations and the ends of the earth are. It is not talking about us. And so it can be actually a helpful decentering of our perceived importance in salvation history if we recognize that, oh, wait a minute, the United States isn't even that old. And whatever pros and cons have happened here with the Christian faith, it's just part of a much larger story. The church is global. Yeah. And so I think those things are really important. And God's people, they're going to be with him in the end, aren't just from the United States.
Yeah. And that is part of that bigger vision of the church.
It is.
The bigger theological vision. And then I think with that view of eschatology, there's so much more to the story still being written, and there's a greater reality. And I think that's maybe a good place to wind us up today, just in the sense of this theology that does inform then how we live in this present moment. And I'm just really grateful for your friendship, Vince. I'm grateful for the conversation today. If people want to catch up with you a little bit more, find out what you're up to, where should they look?
www.vincentbacote.com. And there people can find out what I do, speaking, writing, etc. People want to contact me if people want to invite me to do things. That's one of the primary ways to do that. And by the time that they see that, I hope there'll be some important updates to the website by then.
Yeah. We'll make sure to put that in the show notes for today. Super grateful for you. Thanks for being a friend. Thanks for your work for the sake of good theology, but also for the sake of the church. Grateful to have you with us today.
Thanks. It's great to talk to you.
Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of Field Notes for Pastors. If you enjoyed the episode, please share it with a friend. Give us a like or subscribe to this podcast on platforms where you listen. This podcast is linked with my forthcoming book, The Pastor as Gardener, a renewed vision for ministry, set to be released by Erdman's Publishing on March 24th, 2026. You can pre-order the book anywhere good books are found. And if you do pre-order the book, I have put together some resources as a gift to you. Find out how to access those pre-order resources via my website, mwerickson.com. Until next time, may you experience God's grace wherever God has planted you.